In the Cosmere, magic is usually only available to a select few. Radiants must swear oaths, Allomancy and Feruchemy are a genetic lottery, and on Cell it's based on your ethnic heritage and where you were born. However, magic in the Cosmere follows a strict set of rules, and increasingly it's becoming democratized, being put in the hands of more and more individuals through mechanized means. In this video, I'll be exploring the topic of Roshar and mechanized magic, also known as Fabrials. Originally, this video was going to be on all forms of mechanized magic in the Cosmere, but during my research, I learned that Fabrials are very complicated and very mechanically dense, and they kind of just need their own episode. So subscribe so you won't miss the eventual episode on allomantic grenades, Heon blades, and other forms of mechanized magic in the Cosmere. This video will be sourcing information primarily from the Stormlight Archive, specifically Rhythm of War, as well as Words of Brandon, a little bit from the World Guide preview from the Cosmere RPG, and some general Cosmere-wide mechanics. There shouldn't be any major story spoilers in this video, but if I can't avoid something, I will provide a timestamp for where to skip to. With all that setup and disclaimers out of the way, let's get into the video. The word Fabrial is a blanket term in the Cosmere to describe a magical machine. Artifabrians, engineers and scientists who make these magic devices, have some problems with this, because to them, a Fabrial is a very specific thing. It specifically refers to a gem with a captured spren in it. However, this term has been genericized, and I'll be calling all these machines Fabrials in the video. There are two main types of Roshar and Fabrials. Ancient Fabrials, which have been used since the era of Solitude and maybe a little bit before, and modern Fabrials, which have only really had a couple hundred years of development behind them. These magical machines have a wide variety of uses. They can heat rooms, tell the time, diminish the feeling of pain, stabilize ships, communicate across vast distances, and so much more. The potential for Fabrials to do amazing things and put power directly into the hands of ordinary people is immense. Every modern Fabrial is composed of these four components: a gemstone, a spren, a metal cage, and a source of power. Now, you can make a Fabrial with more than one of each of these, like you could have a Fabrial with 2 metal cages, 2 spren, multiple gemstones, but to require as a baseline, they have to have at least one of those 4 things. Let's break down the importance of each of these components. First, the spren. Different spren create different Fabrials. For example, if you wanted to make a pain reel, you'd need to capture a pain spren in the proper gemstone. Without a spren, all you've got is a pretty looking hunk of crystal and metal. To capture the spren, you need a gemstone of the proper cut. Different types of gemstones attract different spren, and it's likely more related to the color of the stone than its mineral composition. But stick around to hear more of my thoughts on that. This gemstone prison holds the spren, and the metal cage can be built around it. The metal cage that surrounds the Fabrial interacts with the spren that's trapped inside the gemstone, causing some sort of magical effect to occur depending on what type of spren is inside, like heating up an area, detecting emotion, or attracting moisture to an area. Finally, in order to work, the Fabrial must be infused with power, usually Stormlight. The rate at which the Fabrial uses power is determined by the cut of the gemstone, the power of the ability being used, and in some cases, which metal the cage is made of. The metals that the cage is made out of seems to mostly line up with allomancy in dictating how the ability is expressed, whether that be internal or external pushing and pulling metals. Zinc, brass, bronze, pewter, tin, iron, and steel have all been experimented with in world, and the effects that those cages produce is known, although steel is pretty much entirely theoretical. Zinc causes the spren inside to more strongly manifest. Practically, this means that the attribute being expressed by the spren is stronger by forcing the spren to appear more in the physical realm. Let's take a heat reel, for example. If the flame spren trapped in a ruby is in a zinc cage, it forces the spren to manifest more strongly within its gemstone. A brass cage does the opposite, causing the spren to manifest less, meaning things would produce less heat around the Fabrial. Bronze can be used to make an alerter Fabrial, glowing brighter when it detects a specific attribute. Pewter makes augmenters that cause the spren to express its attributes stronger, but not necessarily its realmatic manifestation. Tin diminishes nearby attributes, and an iron cage attracts a substance around it. Think about the chimney Fabrials that attract smoke. A steel cage, while currently theoretical, would make a repeller Fabrial, something that pushes away a substance or an attribute. Gold, copper, electrum, chromium, duralumin, cadmium, and bendalloy have not been experimented with in world because Rosharans don't have access to those metals. They haven't soul cast them or have access to that complex of metallurgy. The reason that metals produce similar effects in Fabrials as they do in allomancy is due to something called spiritual integrity. Spiritual integrity is an odd concept, I know, but it's hugely important in understanding why Fabrials and other types of magic work the same way across the Cosmere. So please bear with me. I feel the same way talking about spiritual integrity as I do talking about quarks and gluons. A feeling that the tiniest bits of the universe somehow got even smaller. However, to understand why Fabrials work the way they do, we have to have a basic grasp on why things in the Cosmere like metals and colors have power and meaning when dealing with investiture. As simply as I can state it, spiritual integrity just means that these metals are going to interact with investiture and the world around them in similar and predictable ways due to some intrinsic element of their spiritual aspect.
Quick question on why does it affect other forms of investiture?
So when I was building the Cosmere, I just had to build certain themes into it, and metal was one of those, right? And the metals kind of like, and have just kind of a sort of spiritual integrity and sort of spiritual component that if I can get into Dragonsteel explaining why, you'll get your kind of origins.
And that's like when Warbreaker metals are different with Awakening and stuff.
Right,
and swords, and shard blades.
And even in Roshar, the cages that you're building for Fabrials, once you start to figure out how those metals affect you, you'll be like, oh wait, that makes sense. And these are just things I've been like, these are just across the Cosmere.
Okay.
And if you want a like in-world answer, it has to do stuff with Dragonsteel, but really the answer is I was building this, I'm like, I just want this to be a theme, and so I'm just going to give this spiritual component to metals.
Okay.
So it works in Mistborn and it works all across everything. So.
As I mentioned before, the effect a metal has on a Sprens seems to mostly line up with how they function in Allomancy. This next section is going to have some speculation on my part as I try to fill in the gaps for what we don't know with the evidence available to us. In the Cosmere RPG, there's going to be an entire path for an Artifabrian, so I'm sure they're going to flesh this out a lot more in that world book. It's not a perfect system, but here's what I've come up with. If you don't agree with what I've come up with, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your deep Cosmere thoughts on the spiritual integrity of metals and how they will affect Fabrials. In Allomancy, pewter and tin are considered internal pushing and pulling metals respectively. When used in a Fabrial, pewter makes an augmenter, which causes a Spren's attribute to strongly express and use investiture more quickly. I think this is because the pewter forces the Spren's own attribute outward. In the case of a heat reel, it would start heating the air around it by pushing and exerting its own attribute onto the world around it. Think of it as generating an AoE heat effect around itself. Tin would do the opposite. In Allomancy, tin is considered an internal pulling metal. In Fabrial science, tin is used to create a diminisher Fabrial. If we use a heat reel as our example again, it would be an AoE of weakening heat sources around itself. At first, this seems like it's doing the opposite of what it does in Allomancy. Allomantic tin increases the senses of the one burning it. But what if instead of thinking about it as augmenting one's actual ability to see or hear, we instead think of it as increasing the body's ability to pull in sensory information? It's not a perfect solution, but it makes sense to me. Zinc and brass seem to interact with Fabrials in a way similar to pewter and tin, which is odd. These are external mental metals, and pewter and tin are internal physical metals. The difference comes in expression versus manifestation of attributes. According to Navani, these two metals are the primary means by which Artifabrians control the strength of an attribute's expression. A zinc cage forces the Spren to manifest more strongly, which I interpret to be its capacity for producing a strong effect. Zinc would pull the Spren more into the physical realm, allowing it to affect the world around it in a more meaningful way. Brass would do the opposite, pushing the Spren out of the physical realm to be more in Shadesmar, diminishing the strength of the Spren's expressed attribute. There's another complicating piece to this. Not only do metals not always line up perfectly with how they work in Allomancy, but the effects that a Spren expresses aren't always very logical or intuitive. I've been using the example of a flame Spren a lot in this video because that's something we've seen a lot of. We have a lot of data to go off of. However, not all Spren are so easy. Logic Spren, for example, don't seem to express an attribute, but they do pulse according to certain stimuli. They will probably be integral in the creation of the first computers on Roshar, as their pulses could serve as off and on inputs.
Are flame Spren, are they all like doing their own thing, or is there some like ideal of fire sitting in spirit forms that they're all based on?
Each Spren is based on the ideal of fire.
Is that sitting in the spiritual world?
Yes, we're using sort of a platonic ideal, and that concept is in force. So, yes, but they are manifestations of it.
With this in mind, the number of spren and metal pairings you could make is staggering, even in the construction of a simple fabrial. But your metal cage that you've made for your fabrial isn't going to do anything until you've got a spren and a gemstone. This is done by luring the desired spren towards a gemstone with a bit of Stormlight. Navani in her lecture on fabrial mechanics says 70% capacity is ideal. The other thing you need to capture a spren and a gemstone is bait, something the spren likes. Different spren are attracted to different things, so the bait needed varies from spren to spren. Once the spren is lured near the gemstone, the remaining Stormlight in the gemstone is removed. There are various ways to do this, but the method doesn't really matter so long as the spren is sucked into the gemstone by what has been described as a type of magical pressure differential. The type and cut of gemstone used is important, and there are 10 types of gems that can be used in the creation of fabrials. These are, unsurprisingly, the Roshar and pole stones, which are diamond, emerald, ruby, topaz, sapphire, emerald, amethyst, heliodor, smokestone, zircon. My theory, and some textual evidence in Rhythm of War, leads me to believe that it is the color of the gemstone that is more important than the mineral composition. Because a couple of these gemstones are the same mineral, just a different color. So I think it's the color that attracts the spren and not necessarily the gemstone itself in the mineral, if that makes sense.
We're trying. Do you know why spren prefer different kinds of gemstones? Because they're different, the sibling said. Why do humans prefer one kind of food or another? Yet foods dyed different colors but with the same taste are often equally acceptable to us. Navani nodded to a small pile of emeralds. Many gemstones are identical, at least in their structure. We think they might even have the same basic chemical composition. Color is like flavor to spren, the sibling said. It is part of the soul of the thing. Curious.
Color, like metal, interacts with magic in similar ways across the Cosmere. It has its own spiritual integrity.
Someone asked earlier if the metal matters for the fabrials, and I was going to follow that up with the gemstones. We know from that the hue seems to matter more than the rarity.
Yeah.
So is that somehow tying into the colors for like Warbreaker?
Yes. That is tying in. Color will be a recurring theme, much as metal will be a recurring theme, as you see different magic systems work. In this case, the color has an effect on the spren and getting a spren crafted.
So just the color itself.
Yeah, the color is the important part. When I was researching Stormlight, I determined that color had to be the point because a lot of the gemstones I'm using are molecularly identical.
Okay.
So
that was the best way to differentiate.
So this was the best way to differentiate. But I already had this as part of the Cosmere, the color and the way people perceive color and things like that were part of it. But getting 10 different gemstones that were molecularly different proved to be very difficult and not worth it. And so, yeah, if you'll look, like a lot of so many of them are just basically the same metal with a few same gemstone with a few impurities. So their crystalline structure is the same.
Before moving on to the 5 known types of modern fabrials, we gotta talk about one more metal, a special metal and its interaction, or rather lack thereof, with fabrials and magic in general. This is, of course, aluminum. Aluminum, sometimes called ralkalest, is magically inert in the Cosmere. You can't affect it with allomancy, shard blades can't cut through it, it blocks spren, and it also can't be forged, and it can't be soulcast. Like, you can create it with soul casting, but you can't magically change it after it's created, which is a little weird.
So, you know that things can be soul casting to aluminum, but can aluminum itself be soul casting to something else?
Resists all forms of investiture trying to change things.
Aluminum interacts with fabrials in some fascinating ways. It can be used to isolate certain aspects of how fabrials work by blocking connection. If you only want an attribute sent in one direction, you can encase the gemstone with aluminum foil in all directions except for the one you want to affect. With conjoiner fabrials, something I'll talk about more in a minute, you're able to isolate different planes of motion. Additionally, spren themselves are blocked by aluminum, which could lead to semi-permeable fabrial housings that lock spren in with like an aluminum door or plug or something, much like how Scions are able to be transported off-world in aluminum boxes.
Okay, let's talk about the 5 known types of modern fabrials. Pairing fabrials are created by splitting a gemstone with a spren already inside it. This creates conjoiner and reverser fabrials.
Conjoiner fabrials work by carefully and deliberately splitting the gemstone that the spren lives in. Conjoiners are usually made using rubies and flame spren. These 2 halves of the gemstone contain half the spren, causing a sort of entanglement. Basically, when one of the conjoined fabrials moves, the other pair matches the movement. This is most commonly done with flame spren, and for good reason. According to Navani, flame spren have proven the best in terms of efficiency for this type of fabrial.
When one side of conjoiner fabrial moves, the other one moves as well. We've seen this used extensively in book, in things like gauntlets and span reeds and towers and even entire lattices to make airships move.
Conjoiner fabrials need to be recharged, and they're affected by distance. The further away a set of fabrials are from each other, the more resistance there is when one tries to use them. This fall-off is a known factor and can actually be used to triangulate location and distance of the other part of the conjoined pair. Span reeds had a certain decay to them. The farther apart they were, the heavier the pens became after activation. In most cases, this was a slight, almost imperceptible difference. Today, the span reed board with pen attached had been placed on Fowler's most precise scale. The pen was hooked by strings to other instruments as well. Navani carefully turned the ruby, indicating she was ready to communicate with her phantom correspondent. The 6th scholar and ardents, Calamy included, seemed to hold their collective breath.
Another quirk of conjoined fabrials is that they're subject to the whims of perception and relativity. For example, if someone tries to write with a span reed in a palanquin, the other pair is going to move as if it were in a palanquin. But if you're on something significantly larger, like a train or a ship at sea, your frame of reference perceives that as not moving, right? So the other pair won't receive that motion. So if you're on a ship, it won't be moving up and down with the waves, it'll just be matching what that person is writing. It's just like how an allomantic speed bubble won't move along with a wagon, but will move along with a train.
Reverser fabrials aren't as common as conjoiner fabrials, but they're made and behave the same way as a conjoiner fabrial, except they're created using an amethyst instead of a ruby, and the movement between the 2 halves is opposite. Next up, altering fabrials. This category includes augmenter and diminisher fabrials. As mentioned earlier, pewter is used in their creation. Some examples of augmenter fabrials are heat reals, shard bows, half shards, and enhancement pane reals. Diminisher fabrials, believe it or not, weaken expressed attributes and are made of tin. The next category, warning fabrials, have a lot of potential in my opinion. These fabrials are known as alerters, and they glow brighter when a specific attribute is detected. We've seen this used in emotion bracelets that can detect specific emotions.
There's also a fun wob that implies that a fabrial could be created to detect allomancy.
Can a bracelet created by Navani be used to detect emotional allomancy? This is possible.
I wonder how far you could push alerter fabrials. Like, how minute can you get it? Could you detect a certain type of lesser spren with a weak presence in the physical realm? Could you detect someone with a high amount of breaths? Could you detect someone using a specific form of investiture, like void light, for example? There are other fabrials we've seen that haven't been identified into one of these groups, like clock fabrials or ship stabilizing fabrials or even ability suppressor fabrials. The category that these fall into is unknown.
In the times of the ancient Radiants, fabrials that could be used by anyone that imitated radiant surges were the main type of fabrial used. The most common kind of ancient fabrial is the Soulcaster, which uses the surge of transformation.
Okay, so this is a little bit of a spoiler for Rhythm of War, so skip to here if you haven't read that book. I don't think it's that big of a spoiler, but if you're sensitive to that information and certain world building reveals, skip here, all right?
What was the fabrial used by Nail to completely revive Zeth at the end of Words of Radiance? That seems like an immensely powerful fabrial, and I don't think it has been mentioned since.
They, during the kind of last days of the heights of the Knights Radiant, they were figuring out how to replicate most Radiant abilities with fabrials. This is where, the Oath Gates as a guide for that sort of thing. And so you're just seeing a fabrial that can replicate what an edge dancer does, or whatnot, or a truth watcher. And there were fabrials created that could do this for all 10 surges. Okay, 9 of the 10 surges. Bondsmithing's its own weird thing, as usual. And so, yes, it's a very valuable fabrial to have. And that is why you haven't seen much more of it, because it is in the hands of the Skybreakers. And we aren't spending a lot of time with the Skybreakers, but yeah, it is a thing they have. And there are fabrials that can replicate the other 8 as well. I mean, you've seen several of them in the books already.
These ancient fabrials, which put surges in the hands of anyone wielding them, are made out of modified radiant spren forced to manifest in the physical realm.
In the past, my kind found it difficult to persuade spren to manifest themselves in the physical realm as devices. It seems void spren are not as naturally self-sacrificing as those of honor or cultivation. For years, they'd assumed no spren were trapped in soul-casting devices. But with the Oath Gates, Navani could travel into Shadesmar, and everything in the physical realm reflected there. Human beings manifested as floating candle flames. Spren manifested as larger or more complete versions of what we see in the physical realm. Soulcasters manifested as small, unresponsive spren, hovering with their eyes closed. So the Soulcasters did have a captured spren, a radiant spren judging by their shape. Intelligent rather than more animal-like spren captured to power normal fabrials. These spren were held captive in Shadesmar, and made to power Soulcasters. Is this the same, perhaps? Navani thought, holding up the gemstone device Kaladin had discovered. There had to be a connection.
I said forced before, but convinced might have been a better word. We don't really know the process that was used to manifest these spren into fabrials. We've seen regrowth fabrials, elves calling fabrials in the form of Oath Gates, and, of course, Soulcasters.
They seem to be made specifically from modified radiant spren, with the surge granted dictated by the type of spren they are. Soulcasters are likely modified cryptics, Oathgates are likely modified ink spren, and if I had to guess, the regrowth fabrial are cultivation spren. Raboniel mentions in Rhythm of War that honor and cultivation spren are more likely to be willing to adopt a fabrial form. So what would an honor spren fabrial do? Gravitation? Superglue?
We're bound to get more information about fabrials and how they work in the Cosmere RPG. There's an entire character path dedicated to Artifabrians, which is just gonna be super cool. What comes to mind to me immediately when theory crafting is something like a heat gun, a directional heat real basically, or a gauntlet that allows you to cool or freeze things when you touch them. And I think that's it for now. This video was a lot for me to wrap my head around. So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends who enjoy the Cosmere. And I'd love to hear some ideas for fabrials you have in the comments down below. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Have an excellent time of day, and I'll catch you all next time. Okay, bye.